Everything returns to the planet.
Naive weakness.
Ready. To the promised land. To the promised land.
Get approaching.
To the promised land.
Naive weakness.
Ready. Ready. I lead you to the promised land. To the promised land.
Get approaching.
To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land.
Naive weakness. Get approaching.
To the promised land.
Get approaching.
Cut. Vanish. To the promised land.
Naive weakness.
Good, good. Ready. Ready. To the promised land. Good, good. Ready. It's time. I lead you to the promised land. I bring you despair, ruination to all. To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land.
Get approaching.
Cut. Vanish.
Naive weakness.
To the promised land. To the promised land.
Get approaching.
To the promised land. To the promised land.
Naive
Quickly. Vanish. To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land. It's time. I lead you to the promised land.
Think again.
Good. Ready. I bring you despair, ruination to all. To the promised land. 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 To the promised land.
Naive, weak. Get approaching.
To the promised land. It's time. I lead you. To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land. I bring you despair. Ruination to all. To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land.
Naive, weak.
Ready. To the promised land. To the promised land.
You are powerless.
To the promised land.
Naive, weakly.
Ready. To the promised land.
You are powerless.
To the promised land. To the promised land.
Naive, weak.
Ready. To the promised land.
Supreme power.
To the promised land.
You are powerless.
Ready. To the promised land. It's time. I lead you. To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land.
Naive, weak.
Ready.
Get approaching.
Cut.
Naive.
Vanish. Cut. Vanish. To the promised land. To the promised land. It's time. Vanish. To the promised land. To the promised land. I bring you despair. Ruination to all. To the promised land. 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 Cut. Vanish. Cut. Vanish. To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land.
Get approaching.
Vanish. It's time. I'll lead you. To the promised land. Vanish. I bring you despair. Ruination to all. Cut. Vanish. To the promised land. To the promised land.
Naive, weak.
Slowly. Ready. Ready. To the promised land. It's time. Vanish.
Get approaching.
Ready. Ready. I bring you despair. Ruination to all. To the promised land. To the promised land.
You are powerless.
To the promised land. To the promised land. To the promised land. Cut. Vanish. Cut. Vanish. Stop pretending you're sad.